Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. If you haven't seen Part 1, head over there to see that one first, and we'll be waiting for you right here. Operational history. Many B-25s served in the Pacific. Although originally designed as a level bomber, jungle warfare made medium-height level bombing not very practical. However, as was stated in Part 1, the Mitchell proved highly adaptable for many tasks, including low-level attack. Instead of dropping bombs from way up, the B-25s would come in low over a jungle clearing and drop bombs that were fitted with parachutes so that they wouldn't fall too fast, explode, and bring down their own aircraft. Strafing became a favorite technique, with more and more guns being added to the B-25 by field modification. Paul Irvin, Pappy Gunn, was a naval aviator and former mechanic who had a knack for coming up with innovations. He field modified B-25s to have up to 18 50 caliber machine guns in the nose firing forward as a pure strafing machine. The B-25G, H, and J were North America's more official answer to a request for anti-shipping and ground attack capability. They mounted more forward-facing machine guns, including some in fuselage-mounted pods, and a 75mm, that's a 2.95-inch M4 cannon. As if it weren't enough, the J version could even fire rockets from under-wing rails fitted to fire outside of the propeller arcs. Over 5,000 of these types were built, with the J version being the last in the line. An anti-ship technique learned in the Pacific was known as skip bombing, where the aircraft would fly low to the water, basically at the height of the mast, aim directly at the target ship, and then release the bomb, like a torpedo bomber, except that the bomb would bounce several times like a stone skipping on a lake and strike the side of the ship. The B-25 was used in North Africa, Sicily, and the Italian campaigns, in not only level bombing, but also in anti-shipping and ground attack roles. The RAF took possession of almost 900 Mitchells and used them to strike out at occupied Europe, to support the Normandy invasion, and some were relocated to the continent for operations in the drive to the heart of Germany. Interestingly enough, the US AAF did not use B-25s in Europe. The Royal Canadian Air Force, RCAF, received about 162 Mitchells and used them for training during the war. As part of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, Mitchells were used along with B-24 Liberators for the heavy conversion process, which eased new pilots into the role of flying the big bombers. The RCAF continued operations with Mitchells until 1963, even receiving, in quotes, new J models in 1951. Well, they were new for the Canadians. The Soviet Union received almost 900 B-25s of various types under Lend-Lease. These were delivered to Russia via the Alaska-Siberia ferry route. They also received one very special B-25, which arrived after the Doolittle raid on Japan, but more about that later. The Russians used their B-25s as a ground support and tactical daylight bomber, and they served everywhere from Stalingrad until the surrender and beyond. NATO used the codename Bank for B-25s, serving with the Soviet Air Force during the Cold War. B-25s also served with the air forces of Australia, the Free Dutch, China, Brazil, and the Free French. Now, normally in this section, I would profile a pilot, known or not, who has flown the type and hopefully pass on some of their impressions of operating it, and tell a story or two about their missions. With an account of the B-25, there is just no way to avoid talking about Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, nor would I want to. Jimmy Doolittle is one of those amazing individuals where, after reading his biography, one shakes one's head and says, how is it even possible that this one guy did so much? He was born in 1896 in California, but spent much of his youth in Alaska. In 1917, he enlisted in the Signal Corps Reserve as a flying cadet and received his Reserve Military Aviator rating and was commissioned a second lieutenant in the Signal Officers Reserve Corps on March 11, 1918. During World War I, he served as a flight and gunnery officer, and after the war was an air racer. But Doolittle wasn't just an aviator. He was also a scholar and intellectual, earning multiple degrees including a doctorate of science from MIT in aeronautical engineering. He pioneered and basically invented instrument flying, being the first pilot to take off, fly, and then land an airplane using instruments alone in 1929. If he had been born a generation later, he might have been an astronaut and might well have elbowed Neil Armstrong out of the way to pilot the lunar module to the moon. Before World War I began, Doolittle had already won 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses. During the interwar period, Doolittle worked for Shell Oil, where many thought he was crazy for pushing for the development of 100-octane fuel, which initially cost $25 per gallon to produce. With Doolittle's guidance, much cheaper ways of producing the 100-octane fuel were developed. No one knew it at the time, but this superfuel would give Allied engines much more power per gallon of gasoline than the Axis engines had, and it would be a war-winning factor. Just before the war, Doolittle returned to active service at the rank of major. After the USA's entry into World War II, Doolittle probably could have continued to serve his country in an important but safe capacity as a staff officer. However, only a month after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he was planning a raid on Japan that Roosevelt hoped would, in quotes, cause confusion in the minds of the Japanese people and sow doubt about the reliability of their leaders, end quotes. The president thought Americans badly needed a boost in morale. The plan was, to be honest, a little nuts. Doolittle and his force would use Army twin-engine bombers to take off from an aircraft carrier within range of Japan. These aircraft had never been intended for carrier operations in anyone's wildest dreams. Even though the launching part seemed almost impossible, returning and landing on the aircraft carrier was actually impossible, even for Doolittle. It would have been closer and more convenient to land at Russian airfields in Vladivostok. However, due to the Russians' neutrality pact with Japan, this was ruled out. A landing 600 miles further away in China would have to do. Doolittle picked the B-25 over several other aircraft, including the Martin B-26 Marauder and the Douglas B-18 Bolo and B-23 Dragon. The Marauder had takeoff characteristics that weren't considered good for a carrier deck, and the other aircraft had longer wingspans that were also limiting on the carrier. The B-25 was the best candidate, and although it would need to be modified to carry double the normal fuel load, it would carry a 2,000 bomb load to Japan. In February 1942, 2 B-25s were loaded onto the U.S. Hornet aircraft carrier and the attempt was made to take off. It worked. 24 B-25Bs were brought to a top-secret modification center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where extensive changes were made to the aircraft, mainly to reduce weight and to add fuel capacity. Some radio equipment was pulled out, the lower gun turret was removed, and mock gun barrels were placed in the tail cone. The ultra-secret Norden bomb sight was removed and replaced with a makeshift timing device, improvised by one of the pilots, Captain C. Ross Greening. This bomb sight, which basically was a metal protractor to measure the angle from the aircraft to the target, cost 20 cents in materials to build. Finally, extra fuel tanks and fuel cells were installed in the top of the bomb bay, crawlway, and lower turret area to increase fuel capacity from 646 to 1,141 U.S. gallons. Cameras were installed to film the raid. 24 B-25 crews were selected and offered to volunteer for the highly hazardous mission. They trained extensively for 3 weeks at a secluded auxiliary airfield of Eglin Air Force Base in Florida starting on the 1st of March 1942. Training involved simulated carrier deck takeoffs, low-level and night flying, over-water navigation, and low-altitude bombing. Several aircraft were damaged during training accidents. However, on the 25th of March, the group of B-25s departed for California for final inspections and modifications, and 16 were loaded onto the USS Hornet. They sailed on April 2nd. On the 18th of April, when they were still 750 miles from Japan, the task force was spotted by a Japanese patrol craft, which, although sunk by gunfire, managed to radio in a warning to Tokyo. Although they were 10 hours early and 170 miles farther away than they had planned, Doolittle decided to go anyway. Unbelievably, none of the pilots, including Doolittle, had made a carrier takeoff before, but they all did so in the next hour, using about 467 feet of runway to get their heavily laden B-25s off the deck. 6 hours after launch, around noon Japanese time, the 16 bombers hit 10 military or industrial targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. Only one B-25 received any battle damage from AA fire. Following the attack, the raiders continued on towards China, where all either crash-landed, ditched, or crashed after the crew bailed out. Doolittle himself was, in quotes, lucky to parachute into a soft dung heap. The only B-25 to survive the raid intact was the one that ended up landing in the Soviet Union. This aircraft actually survived until 1950, when it, sadly, was destroyed in a hangar fire. Even though all these aircraft were lost, amazingly 69 of the 80 flyers escaped to get home. 3 were killed in action and 8 were captured. Doolittle actually thought he might get court-martialed for deciding to attack even when they were spotted so far from Japan and for losing all his aircraft. But, in the end, he ended up receiving the Medal of Honor and going on to be promoted to general and commanding the 12th, 15th, and finally the mighty 8th Air Forces. The raid itself, although it did little material damage, was a huge boost to American morale and a major embarrassment to the Japanese government. It is thought the Japanese efforts to close the gap in their Pacific defenses led to their attack on Midway, which was a turning point in the Pacific War. The B-25s had performed admirably during the raid and proved again that they were highly capable and highly adaptable to roles for which they had not been originally intended. The B-25 was also involved in an incident which would foreshadow the events of 9/11. 56 years later. On Saturday, July 28, 1945, a B-25 named Old John Feather Merchant, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel William F. Smith, Jr., departed Bedford Army Airfield in Massachusetts to Newark Airport in New Jersey on a routine personnel transport flight. At 11:40 a.m., while attempting to land in zero visibility fog, the B-25 slammed into the 79th floor of the Empire State Building in New York City. The 3 crew and 11 people in the building were killed. Betty Lou Oliver was working as an elevator operator that day. When the airplane hit, her elevator cables were cut, and the elevator and she fell 75 stories, ending up in the basement. She survived, and this feat still stands today as the Guinness World Record for the longest surviving elevator fall. Surviving aircraft. I feel like I keep harping on this, but it is a testament to the versatility and adaptability of the B-25 that so many of them continued in military or civilian service long after the guns of World War II had gone silent. Some served another 15 to 20 years in various air forces, and then many went on to work as civilian transports and aerial surveyors. Some went on to continue fighting, not by dropping bombs or strafing, but by dropping water and flame retardants for fighting fires. 18 became movie stars when they were purchased for the filming of the 1970 Paramount film Catch-22. Because of all of this, there are many surviving examples of the B-25, including a fair number that are airworthy. I will mention only two. Mitchell 40-2168, known as Mishap, was one of the first B-25s built and originally had the constant dihedral wings. It had its outer wing panels revised to 0-degree dihedral and flew for several years as an administrative and training aircraft. In 1943, it was modified to be an executive transport and was set aside as General Hap Arnold's personal airplane. After the war, it was sold as surplus on the commercial market and passed through several owners, including Howard Hughes. The plane remains in airworthy condition as November 2825 Bravo, and Mishap has been flying in air shows for the American Air Power Museum for over 30 years. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum's B-25J, known as Hot Gen, was built in Kansas City in 1945 but never saw active military service. It flew as a civilian transport for years and then was spotted abandoned at Wilmington Airport, Delaware in 1975, where it was acquired for the museum. After sufficient repairs to return it to airworthy status, the aircraft was flown to the museum, where it was extensively restored as a B-25 of Royal Air Force No. 98 Squadron. This squadron fought over Northwest Europe during the last 2 years of the war and is dedicated to all of the Canadian airmen who flew with the squadron in the marvelous medium bomber, the B-25 Mitchell. Thanks for watching, and please be sure to share this video with any folks whom you think would appreciate it. Until next time.